it is my great pleasure to welcome to the LTalk stage Ulla Fürstenberg. And Ulla is a senior lecturer in the Department of English Studies at the University of Graz in Austria, where she teaches English language teaching and ELT methodology. Her research interests include the integration of content and language in higher education and teacher language awareness, which is the focus of the LEAP interface project for student teachers of English. The project's been running at the University of Graz for several years and focuses on teaching English as a global language. Ulla has taught professional development courses on teaching in English for lecturers at different universities. She's a contributor to the Austrian coursebook series Way to Go, which is published by OBV for secondary schools, and she is also the co-editor with Jennifer Schumm Fauster of English Language Teaching in Austria, From Theory to the Classroom and Beyond, which is published by Graz University Library Publishing. And it's a practical guide and reference for English language teachers. So please join me in giving Ulla a big welcome to the LTalk stage. Ulla, do you want to pop your mic on and say hello? We'll check everything's working and I will get out of your way. Okay, take care, enjoy.
Thank you. Okay, hello everybody. I've been looking at the chat. Thank you, Charlotte, for this very nice introduction. And I've been looking at the chat and it's amazing to see where you're all from. So thank you very much for joining me here today. I'm going to talk about transition skills in higher education, what, why, and how. Before I get started properly, just a quick explanation as to why I'm talking about this today. This transition skills in higher education is the topic of a position paper I've been working on for OUP. It's currently being edited, so it's not available yet. I'm one of the authors. My co-author was Jennifer Schumm Fauster, and we also had support from consultants, Evangelia and Anne Matsunaga. And so what I'm about to tell you, that's not just all coming from me. It's all based on this position paper that will come out in the summer, I am told. So like me, I'm sure many of you work in higher education. My home university is here in Graz, in Austria. And on my next slide, you'll actually see a little bit of my campus. So, whoops, that was one too far. Here we go. So higher education as a time of transition. Here's the photograph I promised you of my university, the main building in the background and the new library extension in the foreground. So what do I mean when I say that higher education is a time of transition? We all go through transition periods in our lives, and I would say higher education is definitely one of them. And when you talk to your students, when you listen to them, then you hear them talking about how they are busy finding out who they are, learning more about who they are. They are working on their learning preferences, finding out how they learn, and also, of course, where to go next, because higher education also means a transition from learning in a classroom to going to the workplace where you will apply everything that you have learned. So students in higher education are finding out who they are, because I certainly remember this, maybe you do too. When I started university, this feeling that my world was opening up, my world was becoming so much bigger. And for me personally, this was a joyful experience. But of course, it can also be challenging. All the new people you meet and all those new experiences make you question your certainties and make you explore new ways of thinking, and you develop a new sense of who you are, a new sense of self-awareness. So in that sense, higher education is about finding out who you are, finding out how you learn, because, of course, our students don't arrive as blank slates. They've been learners for a very long time. But when they go to university, they encounter content that is more complex. And they often find that the way they've been going about things is no longer appropriate or no longer gets the results that they want. And you could say, if we think of this in terms of transitions, at university, you transition from being a learner who's instructed by a teacher to being a more autonomous learner. And that's also what we require of them very often. We like experiential learning, we like project-based learning, and that requires them to be a certain type of learner as well. And finally, of course, where to go next? This question in higher education, as I was saying, transitioning from learning in a classroom setting to joining the world of work. So in that sense, higher education is a transitional period, a time of transition. So that brings me already to the first question from my title. What are transition skills? What could those skills be? And maybe you'd like to put some ideas in the chat, if you like, pop some ideas in the chat, because of course at the basic level, transition skills, we could say, are skills that allow students to navigate transitions. But what specific skills could those be? Interpersonal skills, yes, definitely. Adaptation, certainly. Mediation, yes. Self-discovery, adaptability, time management, critical thinking. There's a lot of self-reflection. So there's a lot there already. Critical thinking and analysis. Communication, problem solving. More communication, very good. We're a language teacher. Self-awareness, critical thinking, flexibility, leadership, empathy. So all of these skills, it's quite easy to see that they will come in handy and help students navigate periods of transition. Collaboration, resilience, all of that. Fantastic. So for this talk and for the paper I mentioned at the beginning, we came up with 5 key transition skills, and we try to focus on transition skills that are of particular relevance to English language teaching also in higher education. I'll talk you through them quickly. So this is the theory part here. In the next part of the presentation, we'll talk more about activities, but just so that we are on the same page, I'll quickly talk you through our 5 key transition skills. The first one here, communication, collaboration, and mediation. I probably don't have to say so much about that. Communication, collaboration, we do a lot of that in ELT. But maybe mediation is something to keep in mind, and that's also why we added it to this cluster here, because it's of particular relevance, I would say, for English language teaching because of the role of English globally. English has become the global lingua franca. So quite often English is the default medium of communication. So we often use English to mediate between speakers of different languages, to mediate across linguistic and cultural boundaries. So that's why mediation here goes along on this list with communication and collaboration. The second key skill I've listed here is creativity and critical thinking. And I think critical thinking, that also came up in the chat a lot. This is something I would say that we strongly associate with higher education, teaching and practicing critical thinking. But it's important that it also goes together with creativity, and those shouldn't be seen as opposites at all. When we think about creativity in education, I think sometimes we associate that with different levels of education, maybe primary, even pre-primary, where there's a lot of drawing and crafting and singing. activities that are obviously creative. But that doesn't mean that there is no creativity or no room for creativity in higher education. It's just it manifests in a different way. It takes different forms. So, for example, creativity in higher education might be finding new novel solutions or asking new interesting questions. And that's as important as critical thinking, because critical thinking allows us to analyze topics, questions, but then we also need creativity to find new answers that get us where we need to go. So in that sense, if you think about it like this, creativity and critical thinking really complement each other. My third key skill here is cultural intelligence. And again, in today's world, we have so many opportunities to interact with people from different backgrounds and different also cultural backgrounds. So again, it seems a bit like critical thinking. It seems obvious that cultural intelligence would be on our list of transition skills. The important thing here is that cultural intelligence is not only about knowledge about other cultures, 15 facts about. Cultural intelligence is also about attitudes such as openness, empathy, and the ability to look at the world from somebody else's point of view, understanding assumptions and biases. And this is important in real-time interactions, as I was saying, because we get the opportunity to interact with so many people from different cultures. So these are important skills to have. But cultural intelligence is also relevant when you analyze, when you interact with texts, when you engage with texts, written texts or multimodal texts, because there it's also important to be able to spot biases, to spot assumptions. And culturally intelligent people are also what I would call intercultural speakers. So these are the speakers who can mediate and who can communicate well across all of those boundaries. So that's cultural intelligence, not just knowledge, but also attitudes, a certain way of approaching. I can see it here in the chat, people saying respecting cultures, being curious, being open, and the attitudes are really the key to this. So that's important to remember, not just knowledge, but also attitudes. Reciprocity, that's another good one here. Then the next key skill on my list is self-leadership. And self-leadership, and this may sound a bit paradoxical, is particularly important in our interaction with others. Self-leadership is closely linked to emotional intelligence, and just like emotional intelligence, it's about the ability to manage your own emotions, but also assess and react to the emotions of others. Self-leadership is also about the ability to self-assess, to self-regulate, to become more self-aware. It helps you with goal setting. It's about reflecting, planning, negotiating, adapting to changes, and so on. And all of this, it helps us in our interaction with others. So that's what self-leadership is really about here. Not just about being self-regulated, achieving your goals and so on, but about doing all of this in interaction with others, knowing ourselves better. Yeah. And the final key skill on my list here is digital literacy. That's another obvious one, I would say. So that's something we've all been very concerned with over recent months and years. In our society, we use digital technologies so much. Look at us here. We couldn't interact, we couldn't be here together today if it weren't for those technologies that are now available to us. And this bears repeating. So these digital technologies really open up many opportunities to us, and they allow us to do many things that we couldn't otherwise do. And this is, but in addition to this, of course, these technologies also raise questions, issues such as cybersecurity, digital ethics, that our learners, that our students will also have to deal with. Another thing about digital literacy is that, and this is true of all the transition skills, but maybe digital literacy in particular, it can't be seen in isolation. It's connected to many of the other transition skills. So we already said that a lot of communication today is digital communication, not just face-to-face. So it's both communication and digital literacy. Cultural intelligence, we said we interact so much with people from other cultures. And of course, not all of these interactions are in real life. They also happen online. So digital literacy is connected to the other transition skills as well. So again, this is not these 5 key transition skills are transition skills that I would say are can easily be integrated into English language teaching in higher education. So, and that already brings me to my second question. Remember, we had what are transition skills? So I think we've answered this a bit, but I will come back to the transition skills also when I talk about the activities in the next part of the presentation. So that was only meant to be a short introduction to this idea of transition skills. So here's my second question now. Why should transition skills be incorporated into ELT in higher education? And I see the first answers coming in already: to enable students to be more successful in their learning, definitely. And so feel free to answer this question in the chat, see what you think. What I also mean with this question is why ELT in particular? So I said transition skills are a particularly good match for English language teaching. Why do you think? Do you agree? And why do you think ELT is a particularly good match for transition skills? So here we are. Over to you. What do you think? To prepare them for real life, to navigate life, definitely. Yeah. Promote effective teaching and learning. That's interesting. Be effective communicators. Make teaching effective. So, yeah, to be productive. They help support the other skills. I like these comments because transition skills are not something that's separate from what we do in the language classroom. That's a very important point. They really go together with language teaching. So it's not a question of either or. And it's not the case that if we do more work on transition skills, we do less language work. They really work well together and complement each other. Make ELT effective in that sense. I agree. Real and meaningful learning. That's another one. I think that's a very good comment, because these are things we think about, topics we think about all the time, skills they have to develop anyway. So that really can make their experience in the ELT classroom more meaningful. Yeah. Better outcome, prepare future leaders, definitely. Yeah. Okay. To get them prepared to engage in communicative activities in the classroom. Again, I agree. I think they really go together. You need those skills on the one hand to really get more out of your education, get more out of your English lessons, but on the other hand, they are preparation for the world beyond the university, global citizenship. Absolutely, very good. Okay, moving on. So transition skills and advanced language learning in ELT in higher education. So these are my ideas as to why I think that ELT and transition skills go really well together. In ELT, there's a lot of things that we already do. For example, we promote independent learning. So that's something we do anyway, and that goes really well with those transition skills. we take the roles and functions of English globally into consideration. I think we probably do this more in higher education than at other levels of education because of who our students are, who our learners are. They already use English a lot. They communicate a lot in English, and I think we simply go along with that as well, and see English as a global language, a global lingua franca for communication. One of our goals, I would say, in English language teaching in higher education is to help our students find their voices as really proficient users of English. It's one of the challenges, and also I would say one of the great things about working in ELT in higher education is that our learners are really proficient users of English already. And then we already look beyond the walls of the classroom a lot. So we talked about this transition from education to work. And I think that's something that we do anyway, because English is a global language. It's something our students use outside the classroom as well. So we pick up topics from media, we engage with topics that are being discussed that our students are interested in. So I would say these are the reasons, some of the reasons that I can see why transition skills can be integrated into English language teaching in higher education quite easily. Okay, so, and now my third question, how can we integrate transition skills into English language teaching in higher education? And now we are switching gears a bit. So far, I've tried to give you a bit of input, explain what I mean by transition skills and why I think that they are a good fit for English language teaching in higher education. In the next part of my presentation, I'd like to show you some activities, one for each of the key skills I've mentioned, and explain how I think they can also contribute to the development of language skills, because that's, I've said that a few times now, it's not either or as far as I'm concerned. Transition skills work and language skills work go together and really complement each other. Okay, so how can we integrate transition skills? So here is my activity for the first key skill: communication, collaboration, and mediation. So I said at the beginning that mediation is something that is becoming more and more important. You might also be familiar with it from the Common European Framework of Reference, where there's also a lot of emphasis is put on mediation, and I linked it earlier to the global role of English, where we often use English to mediate between speakers of different languages. And this is something that this activity maybe doesn't try to replicate, but it tries to create a similar situation so that the students can become more proficient and more comfortable in such situations. So this is my activity, mediating current events. The first thing you have to do here is you have to try and think of a few news events, current events that are reported on globally. And these can be things such as, I don't know, maybe the opening of the Olympics, something like that, something that is reported on in many different countries, many different languages. So as the teacher, what you do is you make a list of such events, and then you divide the students in your class into smaller groups of 3 or 4 students, and they choose randomly from your list of current events. So you can make it a bit fun and have your events on small slips of paper, and every group just picks a slip of paper. So instead of you assigning them, they pick one randomly. So now every working group has one global news event. And the next step is that within those working groups, each of the students picks a different newspaper, ideally from a different country, and analyzes the coverage of their event. So, and at this point, you can help them a bit. You've got my questions here in the pink box. So these are things they could look out for. In my newspaper, how much space is given to the event? What aspects are highlighted? What is the newspaper's point of view? So each of the students in a working group looks at these questions in a different newspaper, and there are websites you can go to where you can find these newspapers. So there we go. And then within the working group, they present their insights to each other. So they explain, they mediate to each other how their newspaper reported on those news events. And if you have multilingual groups, that's great, because then they can pick newspapers in different languages, and you have that aspect in there as well. And then the group synthesizes the information, and finally they present their insights to the rest of the class, so that everybody in the class can hear about all the different news events. So that would be one way you can practice the skill of mediation. And here on the slide, it says mediation is not the same thing as translation. So I said, if you have a multilingual group, then they can pick newspapers in different languages, and that's great. But what they will find out, what they will learn when they do this task, is that translation is not enough. When you mediate, you also have to mediate cultural factors. You have to mediate the context, because it's not enough to translate. You have to provide that information for your interlocutors as well. And that, again, that's a situation we're all familiar with. That's something that happens a lot, that you have to mediate in this way. And this is an activity that allows the students to practice that in the classroom. Language-wise, of course, there's a lot going on there as well. Advanced language skills work, because they have to be able to present their ideas in a clear and concise fashion. And what they also have to do is it's very likely that they are not always 100% sure what is going on and how they can explain it. So a lot of hedging will also come into it. They a very nuanced communication. And so again, we are practicing the skill of communication, collaboration, and mediation, but we are also doing very advanced language work here. So that would be a suggestion for how you can integrate mediation into your English language lessons. Okay, moving on to the next key skill. Our second key skill was creativity and critical thinking. And here is an activity where this plays a role. And here, earlier I talked about how creativity shouldn't be seen as the opposite of critical thinking. And now I want to tackle maybe another misunderstanding. And this is the misunderstanding of the term critical thinking, or in our case, reading critically, critical reading, because students sometimes think that reading critically basically means criticizing the text, and that's not necessarily true. So it's more than that. It doesn't just mean being critical of the text, it means analyzing it and thinking about how the writer presents information, for example, what their stance is, and so on. So in this activity, this is a writing activity, writing a critical review. And it's important to remember that in this activity, we focus on the process of writing rather than the end product. So the process of writing in the classroom is really foregrounded here. So for this one, you pick a text that you'd like to work on, and the students then read the text critically. You've got a lot of options here when it comes to what text you should choose for this. It depends on what type of class you teach. So, for example, if you teach academic writing, it could be a peer-reviewed article from a journal in a specific field, or you could pick a newspaper article from a broadsheet, or you could pick some pop science article from a magazine, whatever fits in with the topic and the format of your course. And then the students engage with this text, read it critically. So this could entail, I don't know, previewing, annotating, summarizing, analyzing, going back and rereading, all of those skills. Now, these are not necessarily things that the students automatically know how to do. And you can and you should help them at this point. You could even provide them with a checklist of things they could look for in the text. And then, so this is done individually, and in the next step, students share their findings in small groups. So they basically explain to each other what they have found out. And then the teacher introduces the text type. In our case, it's a critical review. And like many text types, it has specific characteristics that are always present. For example, you have a clear thesis statement, there's a summary of the text, then there's a critique, and so on and so forth. And we haven't written anything yet, so we are still talking. And in the next step, in their small groups, students then discuss what they would put in the various sections of their critical review. So how would they summarize the text? What would their critique be? How would they comment on the line of argumentation? So they brainstorm all of this, and then they finally begin writing. They write individually in class. As I said, it's important that here it's all about the process of writing. So the writing happens in class, at least the first stages. And the advantage of this is that the teacher is around. You can support the writing process. They can ask you if there's something they haven't understood, and so on. And you build up this argument. Out of the corner of my eye, I'm trying to watch the chat here. I saw a comment going past on artificial intelligence, and I'll come back to this. But just very quickly, this, of course, means if they are working on this in class, working together, that's a different approach. Also, this focus on the process, I think, means that, yes, you might use AI tools for brainstorming or whatever, but it's very much also an opportunity to talk about the writing process. Why do we write? And writing also helps us to think, to develop our thoughts on an issue. So that's a task here, an activity that you might want to consider if you'd like to integrate critical thinking and creativity into your teaching. Integrated with a more standard writing task, foreground the process of writing and the thinking that goes into writing a text. Okay, so I've been doing a lot of talking, so I'll just give you a chance here very quickly to think of activities that you could use in your own context with your own students to promote the two skills we've been talking about: communication, collaboration, and mediation. That was the activity where they looked at news events, or critical thinking and creativity. That was the one about writing critical reviews. So you can either just think about it, but if you'd like to share ideas in the chat, that would also be great. I'll do my best to keep up. Pen pal projects dealing with global issues. That sounds really interesting. Yeah. Podcast for a digital magazine. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, yeah, the difference between criticizing and critical thinking, I think that's a good opportunity to talk to them about this. discussing videos and movies and writing articles for a school magazine. I like this because I think it's great motivation for students if what they write is actually published in some form. I think that's a very good idea. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and students are sometimes not used to doing this even in their mother tongue, in their first language. I absolutely agree. And hopefully this will carry over. So again, our job as English language teachers is to develop their language skills, but that doesn't mean that we can't also try and develop skills that they will find useful in other contexts as well. Very good. There's so many great ideas going past. I'll move on anyway now to my next key skill. The next key skill is cultural intelligence. This is an activity that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It's a simulation card game called Banga. And it's a simulation card game that simulates cross-cultural communication. Maybe that's the best way of saying it. You can easily find the materials online. They are freely available. So when you play Banga, this is what happens. You can use normal playing cards, and you divide your class into groups of students, a minimum of 3 students, and these groups sit at different tables, and they all receive a slightly different set of instructions for a card game called Banga. And of course, the different groups don't know that they have different instructions from their classmates. The students are told that they can't use verbal communication, so they can't talk to each other and they can't write down any words. And this is how the game is played. So they learn to play this card game according to the instructions that they've been given, and every group at every table learns to play essentially a slightly different card game. And so they play a round of this, and after the first round, the winner and the loser at each table move on to play the game with a different group. And you can imagine what happens now, because now you've got people sitting together. They still can't talk. They can't write messages to each other. They have to play in silence. But now you've got groups at each table, mixed groups, people who have learned to play this game according to different rules, and they now try to play it according to the rules they have learned. So it goes on like this, and these misunderstandings, the students now try to resolve their misunderstandings non-verbally. And you play a few rounds of this. It's recommended that you play at least 5 rounds of Banga. So this is the simulation activity. And then afterwards, there's a debriefing where the teacher explains explains what the setup was, explains about the different instructions and so on, and then talks about their experience with the students. And Banga can get quite intensely frustrating for the students, which is great in a way. That doesn't sound very nice of me, but it's great because it gets them engaged, it gets them talking. And so you can ask them different questions. You might ask them, what were your first impressions? Did your impressions change at all? What real life experience did this remind you of? Or are there any real life experiences that this reminded you of? What do you take away from playing this game? And this debriefing really turns Banga into quite a powerful learning experience. It's an intriguing game, but it's really the debriefing where the students get the opportunity to reflect under the guidance of the teacher. And this is something I'd like to focus on here, the role of the teacher here, because the role you take on in this as a teacher could be described as a cultural mentor. You act as a cultural mentor. And I think this, and you scaffold your students' learning in that role. And I think that's an important point to remember, because we talked about a multilingual classroom when we were talking about the newspapers, how we can use that. And of course, our classrooms are also multicultural, and it's tempting to think, well, our students will become culturally intelligent just by being in a classroom with so many peers from different cultures. But an activity such as this one is still helpful if you take on this mentor role and help them to engage with those issues on that level as well. So that would be a suggestion for practicing developing students' cultural intelligence. And again, the materials are very easy to find. If that sounds like something you might want to try, you should absolutely go for it and see how you get on. Okay, right. So we go on to the next key skill, which is self-leadership. And for self-leadership, my suggestion is to set up a personal vocabulary project. Now, this one, again, coming back to something I said at the beginning, English is now the global lingua franca. And as I said earlier, especially in higher education, our students are not just learners of English, they are learners in our classroom. But in addition to that, they're also users of English, quite proficient users of English. And this is now a bit like what I said about being a cultural mentor. It's kind of sometimes tempting to think, well, they get a lot of input, so obviously, their English will probably just improve by itself. And this may be true, but they need help and support to get even more out of all the input they can now get from the world around them. And this is where the personal vocabulary project comes in, which can also help them develop self-leadership skills. It's important here, I would say, I would argue, especially again with our students, with learners in higher education, to be quite open about the goals here, both the language goal and also the goal of developing self-leadership skills. So what you do is you tell your students that over the course of, I don't know, a semester or a year or the duration of your course, they will take more responsibility for their learning, especially vocabulary learning. But this is important, it's not going to be completely random. You are going to set the parameters. You start by telling them to identify an English language free time activity, which they do anyway, but which they could use to expand their vocabulary. And they should also decide what media they use as input. So for example, what you could say is, or a simple example, you might have a student who really enjoys medical dramas and watches them all the time. So they could decide to exploit that and base their vocabulary project on this. So they might like to work on topic-related language, both technical terminology and also functional language, and so on. So everybody in your group decides individually, and this is individual. So one student might decide to work on medical dramas. Another student is probably a gamer, and they might want to work with that sort of language, and so on. So once they've all decided on their topic or on the free time activity they want to use, you help them draw up a plan on working on their project throughout the semester or during the duration of your course. So that means you set certain benchmarks and they work out at what point they will achieve those benchmarks. And they should also think about how they are going to reach those benchmarks. And another thing you should talk about is how they are going to record the new vocabulary. I find with my students, that's not something they do a lot. So I think we've moved past the era of vocabulary books. So that's something that might be worth talking about. So this is a very open format, but it's not random. So they get to choose how they want to go about this. They get to choose their own their own approach, but it's still within the framework, within the parameters that you set. And this also means that at various points throughout your course, there will be progress reports. You could, for example, ask them to keep a learner diary. That can be fun. Or they can report verbally in class. And this should not be seen really as you assessing them. This is an opportunity to give them feedback and maybe also offer a bit of guidance. So, and then you wrap up the project at the end of your course. You can do mini presentations or portfolios. So whatever, and you can also open this up a bit and let the learners decide, the students decide how they want to present their results. So again, on the level of transition skills, this is an opportunity for them to develop self-leadership skills. Goal setting comes into it, all kinds of things, taking responsibility for their own learning. And it also helps them to take advantage of all the input at their disposal. Yeah, self-reliance beyond the classroom. Absolutely, that's it. So it's great for language learning. It does expand their vocabulary, hopefully in an area they're interested in. And at the same time, they acquire skills that they will hopefully find useful, because language learning doesn't stop. English will always be, and wherever they find themselves working, English will always be important, and they will need those skills to keep working on their language, to keep improving their English. So that's key skill number 4, self-leadership. And I'll move you along again to my next slide. So can you think of activities with your own students in your context, in your own context, that promote cultural intelligence or self-leadership? And we'll do this. Yeah, learning languages doesn't stop. So that's really so very true. We all know this. That's right. Okay. Okay, very good. Project work, absolutely, yeah. Okay, language and culture definitely goes together, no question about it. Yeah. Okay, very good. So moving on, and here, as I said before, of course, digital literacy, key skill number 5, and we have to talk about artificial intelligence here, because that's been something that has really dominated, I would say, discussions in our field a lot, for very good reasons, because it has an impact on a lot of things that we do in our classrooms. So digital literacy skills, I'll show you this one activity, and this is how you can set it up. So one thing I would say that's very important, we said earlier, so there are lots of great things about all those digital tools that we now have at our disposal, but we also have to deal with the questions that arise because of those tools, ethical questions and so on. And this is, of course, very true for using artificial intelligence. And we'll try a little experiment here. I'd like you to think of a writing project that you've got going on at the moment in your lives. Might be a project report or a proposal that you have to write, and just decide whether you are going to use AI tools for your writing or whether you're not going to use AI tools. So this is not you as a teacher now. This is something you have to write, you as a writer. And could you just share some arguments in the chat? So if you have decided not to use AI tools, why? And if you have decided to use them, why? So I'll just give you a bit of time. It doesn't have to be 90 seconds, but just share some arguments for or against using AI tools for a writing project. Yes, to save time. Absolutely. Okay. Very good. I wouldn't use it. I want to see my personality in my writing to get some ideas, maybe. Yeah. Brainstorm, or I would use it to paraphrase. Very good. Achieve clarity, polish my writing, use it as a starting point. Yeah. Save time again. Yeah. So sometimes I would use it, sometimes I wouldn't. Yeah. So we shouldn't avoid it. Editing. Yeah. Start thinking, and so on. Okay, so there are lots of interesting things happening here in the chat. And this is exactly how you can start with your students as well, if this is something you would like to discuss. And you can set the time limit. I said here, write for 90 seconds. It could be more than that in class. And you do exactly what I just tried to do with you. Would you use it? Yes or no? Write down arguments. And at this stage, the goal is really just to get them writing. And then you've got a lot of material to work with. Here we go. And then you can negotiate a code of conduct for artificial intelligence. So using AI tools in your class, in their writing. And the goal here is to find common ground, to decide together. So we don't, as language teachers, I think we never want to end up in a situation where we have to police their writing and see if we can catch them. I saw in the chat people saying there's no point banning it, and I absolutely agree. On the other hand, there are also ethical questions connected to this, academic integrity and so on. So we just need to talk about this. And now we can take all those ideas that we have generated in the first step, and then you could come up with a list of guidelines. And these could be guidelines such as AI tools can be used to refine the first draft of your essay. So similar ideas were mentioned in the chat. Or you could say AI tools always have to be cited, or you can't use them at all, and so on. You get the idea. And then you discuss this with the whole class, and you decide together how you are going to deal with AI tools in your class, in your particular context. And if you want, you can then refine this, condense this into a code of conduct. You could even, depending on your institutional rules, you could even get your students to sign it. But in any case, this is a way of dealing with it that doesn't put you in a position where you allow or ban things. It's more, it reinforces this idea of we are in this together, we are developing these skills together. Because AI is new for us, but it's also new for our students when we are all trying to find our way in this. Okay, so we are getting closer to the end of my session. So finally, now, here's my question for you. How difficult do you think it would be for you to integrate transition skills into your own teaching? So I started out by saying transition skills can easily be integrated, but now I'm curious, and the poll is here for you. So how difficult do you think it would be for you personally to integrate those transition skills from A, not difficult at all, to E, extremely difficult? So if you could answer that. Okay, easy with some reflection. Somebody says here, a bit difficult. Yeah. Okay. How are we doing with the poll? Not difficult. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. not difficult, a bit difficult. Okay. Somebody says B here. Okay. Not difficult, not difficult at all, a bit difficult. I haven't seen, so based on the chat, I haven't seen anyone say extremely difficult, so that's great. I'm very happy to see that. So, right, can I? Yes. So if I move on to my last slide, so this is just coming back to my points from the beginning. I'm happy to see that most of you said not difficult at all, or not very difficult, maybe a bit difficult, because what we have to keep in mind is what I said at the beginning. We already do a lot of that in our work as English language teachers, and also the extent to which we integrate transition skills is flexible. So nobody says you have to do it all the time, or nobody says you have to do all of it. But if you look at your existing materials, I'm sure you'll find that very often you can tweak them to have more of a transition skills focus. And again, as I tried to show you throughout, transition skills work offers great opportunities for advanced language work. The two really go together. And that's it from me. Thank you. So I'd be happy to answer some questions.
Okay, Ulla, if you want to have a look in the Q&A box,
Yeah.
there have been some questions put there for
Very
you,
good.
if you'd like to have a look at those.
Okay. Right, let me just go back to the beginning here. Okay. In certain situations, Sayira said here, in certain situations, it's difficult to maintain self-discipline. How do you overcome or tackle such situations? That's a very good question. I think this is particularly because a lot of language learning now happens outside the classroom. And I think one thing we can do to help our students maintain self-discipline in terms of language learning is to show these connections, to make these connections for them and say, look what I do here in my classroom. This is connected to what you do in your personal life, in your free time with English. And I think one thing we have on our side as English language teachers is precisely this global role of English. And I think that's another thing we can foreground in our teaching and say, look, this is just something that will be so helpful to you. If you, we talked about those nuances, hedging the advanced language skills, that's something you will really be able to use. So that would be my answer here. Right, let me see what else we've got here. How much time? That's a very specific question. How much time would I plan for mediating the current events activity? That's a question from Max. So I tend to think in like 90-minute sessions, but because that's what I'm used to. But in this case, I would say it's very, very flexible because you can split it up. So you could just take a bit of time at the end of your session and set up the activity, form the groups, send everybody away to read their texts and to prepare, and then have another half hour or so in the following session to talk about this. Or you could have the whole thing in class if you have that amount of time. So this one, I would say, is very flexible. Okay. Max, would you allow AI to be used by students in writing? If you do, would AI take away the critical thinking of the students? This is something, as I said earlier, I think our best way forward is really to negotiate that with the students and see what we can all agree on. But this is, I think, a very important comment. Does it take away the critical thinking of the students? And to a certain extent, I think if they use it uncritically or if they don't reflect on their use, yes, it does a bit. So what I think is very important to explore in teaching writing is the connection between writing and thinking, because writing often also helps us think, to formulate our thoughts, to think more deeply. And this is something I think we should explore with our students. How are thinking and writing connected? And again, as I said, focus on the process. It's not just about submitting the perfect essay or submitting the perfect critical review, because, well, perfect, but AI can help you submit a very polished piece of work, but as somebody said earlier, it doesn't have your personality, and you've also missed out on an opportunity for critical thinking. So maybe that's another thing. Communicate this to them in terms of opportunities, not something they are not allowed to do, but opportunities they miss out on if they fall back on those tools. I think, is my time up, or do I have time for another question?
You might be able to squeeze a quick one in.
Okay.
If there's one more you want to answer, go for it.
One more. Yeah. Okay, please give an example of a personal vocabulary project for primary and secondary level students. I think a very similar approach, you just have to break it down for them. So definitely for secondary school students, because this engagement with English outside the classroom doesn't just start at university. I may have given that impression because I said our students are very proficient users of English and so on. But younger students do that as well. So you could say, definitely what I would say is they need more guidance. But these can all be stepping stones. So you might have with younger, less advanced learners, you might have to give them more scaffolding and maybe define more intermediate steps for them to take. But they can definitely go out, find words they find interesting, and work on them. So yes, I think it's a particularly interesting activity to do with students in higher education, but that doesn't mean you can't do it with less advanced learners, and I didn't mean to give that impression. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ulla. I'm sure that you can see all of the love that's been coming in the chat box for that wonderful, wonderful session. Wasn't that brilliant, everyone? And it's just been really interesting to hear you talking about the ways that these transitional skills can be practically introduced into the classroom. And I don't know about everybody in the chat box, but I, for one, am really excited to go and play Banga in my classroom.
You should absolutely do that. You'll have a great time.
Oh, so thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you everybody for sticking it out to the end.